Hello, friends. Today I'm going to read from my edited and annotated edition of SATOW'S diaries for 1895 to 1900 when he was British Minister in Tokyo. Now, this was first published by Edition Synapse in 2003, and this is that book. It's a little bit faded now, but anyway, that's this book. You can see the Japanese here. Chunichi Koshi Jidai. So when Ernest Sato was the minister. Um, After that book sold out, it was a fairly limited print run, I think, and quite an expensive edition. I then created a paperback, which is US letter size with lulu.com. It's still available. 8.5 inch by 11 inch is this size. So it's almost the same size or similar size to the first edition, as it were. And the hot news, as it were, is that this is the latest version, 6 by 9 inch, created with Amazon.com. So this is a handy size, and it's pretty good. Some pages seem to be a little bit small, I have to say, but well, I can. They're all legible. There's no problem with that. So anyway, that's the situation, and I will start to read. Well, I'll share the screen first of all. I'll start from the very beginning, as they say. Okay, here we are. The Diaries of Sir Ernest Sato, British Minister in Tokyo, 1895 to 1900. A diplomat returns to Japan. Edited and annotated by Ian Ruxton with an introduction by Nigel Brailey. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He passed away some years ago. All right, so this explains, this is the third edition. Whoops. How did that jump up? It jumped up. Sorry, I need to go back to previous page. Yes. This is the third edition, a handy-sized paperback and hardcover, 6 by 9 inches, published through Amazon KDP in Kee-tah-kew-shoo, Japan by Ian Ruxton in July 2024. And those are the ISBNs for the paperback and hardcover. And what I've just told you, basically, the first edition published by Edition Synapse, second edition through Lulu Press in 2010. My email, Library of Congress control number. I'm not sure if that only applies to the first edition, but I haven't renewed it at any rate. There's a copyright notice about the National Archives from which Sato's diaries are where they are available. There's some relevant books by the same author, which I'm going to just skip over right now. Here is Sato in 1900 in the Illustrated London News. The prominent diplomat. And here is Sato as in a cartoon by Spy, Sir Leslie Wart in Vanity Fair, April 23rd, 1903. So he's quite a tall man, but also not very, or quite slim. Okay, here are the contents for this book. The same for each of the editions that I have talked about. So 1895 May is the start. Sato arrives in Japan on July 28th, 1895. He goes to England for the Diamond Jubilee in 1897, Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. He comes back to Japan, and then in 1900, he leaves Japan on May the 4th. He's in England for a while, and he starts his posting in China on September the 29th. The Chuzenji Diary, which is his time at Lake Chuzenji, his place where he rested, is also given here separately. Abbreviations Foreign Office list extract, bibliography and index. Okay, so this is my editorial preface and acknowledgements. It is hoped that the publication of an annotated and indexed transcript of Sir Ernest Mason Satow's handwritten personal diaries for the years 1895 to 1900 in the original English will be welcomed by scholars and students of Japanese history and diplomatic history as a valuable contribution to understanding not only the man himself, but also some of his very wide circle of friends and acquaintances in both Victorian Britain and Meiji Japan, and the context leading to the pivotal Anglo-Japanese alliance, which was signed by Lord Lansdowne and the Japanese minister Baron Hayashi Tadasu in London, rather surprisingly without Satow's knowledge, on January 30th, 1902. Mason was Satow's mother's family name, so she was Margaret Mason, by the way. That's why his full name is Ernest Mason Satow. Satow's diaries also throw light on the conduct of diplomacy in Tokyo at a time when the diplomatic corps and the British mission legation were very small. The narrow circle of senior diplomats and officials at Tokyo at the time helped to create an intimacy which was impossible in the second half of the 20th century. And these diaries show clearly that he was granted unprecedented personal access to the top Meiji statesmen and politicians, both because of his previous postings in Japan, 1862 to 83, which I have described in The Diaries and Letters of Sir Ernest Mason Satow, Edwin Mellon Press, 1998, and thanks to his profound knowledge of the Japanese language and culture, widely acknowledged by the Japanese themselves as outstanding. Well, at the time I wrote this, annotated diaries, transcribed and annotated diaries of 1861 to 9 and 1870 to 83 had not yet been published. So that's why I refer back to my first book, The Diaries and Letters of Sir Ernest Mason Satow, Edwin Mellon Press, 1998, only here. The diaries in this volume are complete and unbroken from Ernest Satow's arrival in Japan on July 28, 1895 as Minister Plenipotentiary and Envoy Extraordinary, after the brief tenure in that post of P.H. Lapoa Trench, June 25th, 1894 to May 10th, 1895, until his departure on May the 4th, 1900. That's Satow's departure. Before and after these dates, a few selected partial entries have been included by way of introduction and conclusion, a kind of prologue and epilogue, with a very brief narrative commentary. For those readers who seek a more condensed version or summary of the highlights, my essay entitled Sir Ernest Satow, 1843 to 1929 in Tokyo, 1895 to 1900, in the recently published Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, Volume 4, edited Hugh Cortazzi, Japan Library, 2002, may be helpful. It is chapter 7, pages 53 to 63. The late Chuzenji Diary, or Chuzenji Diary, as I have chosen to call it, recounting some of the events, at Satow's and other diplomats' recreation hideaway villas near Nikko, appears separately from the main diary in the Satow papers, and it has here been presented separately, although it covers almost the same time period, i.e. August 20th, 1895 to April 9th, 1900. And in fact, some early entries are almost identical. Apart from reflecting Satow's apparent intention that the Chuzenji Diary should stand alone, this has been deemed a more convenient way to present what is essentially Satow, his friends and acquaintances, mostly the corps diplomatique, their families and friends, and short-stay visitors such as admirals and other dignitaries, relaxing, i.e. going for walks, botanizing, at which Satow was expert, rowing, sailing, etc., away from the daily grind and summer heat of Tokyo. An alternative way would have been to incorporate all of the Chuzenji Diary's entries chronologically into the main diary, even though they are rather different in character. It is hoped that readers and researchers will not be unduly inconvenienced by the chosen mode of presentation and may indeed find it useful in some respects. I think Nigel Brailey would have preferred me to incorporate the Chuzenji Diary into the main diary, but I was never quite sure why. And anyway, I did not do so. I have added many explanatory footnotes, and in some cases further information has been given in square brackets in the main text, a name index in which footnotes appear in bold type, a list of principal abbreviations used by Satow, who had his own system of speed writing, and a select bibliography of Sato-related works have been provided at the back of the book after the diaries. All errors of whatever kind are, of course, the responsibility of the editor. That's me. It will be evident that many of the footnotes have been written with reference to annotations in Mr. Shozo Nagaoka's two-volume translation of the diaries into Japanese, ERNEST Sato Koshi Nikki, and I here explicitly acknowledge my debt of gratitude to him before any other scholar. Without his pioneering work and his encouragement, which was both frequent and friendly, I might never have been inspired to undertake the seemingly never-ending task of editing Sato's diaries for this period. Sato's diaries of his life began much earlier in 1861 when he was a young man of just 18 years and apparently ended in 1926, some 3 years before his death. At the end of that year, in fact. It is thus a sobering thought that the present lengthy tome represents just a small part of the total journal. Yes, Nagaoka-san was very helpful, and he later translated my first book, The Diaries and Letters of Sir Ernest Sato, with Sekiguchi-san. Anyway, Nagaoka-san has also passed away quite some time ago. Equally, I must acknowledge the assistance of Sir Hugh Kotatsi, GCMG, who made some valuable suggestions when he saw the first draft. Dr. Nigel Brailey, lecturer of the Department of Historical Studies at Bristol University, for his expert comments and introduction, and the staff of the Public Record Office at Kew, Southwest London, where the original diaries are held, reference PRO 3033, 15-17, as part of the voluminous Sato papers PRO 3033, 1-23, which were deposited there after Sato's death in August 1929 in accordance with his wishes. Well, of course, nowadays, it's not the Public Record Office, it's the National Archives, which include the Public Record Office. I'm not sure when that change occurred, but anyway. The diaries are also available elsewhere on microfilm. And of course, I thank Mr. Takahiko Kaneko, who so kindly agreed to publish this book, and my wife Asako for her unfailing support and encouragement. Ian Ruxton, Kyushu Institute of Technology, KIT, or normally we call it QTech these days, Kee-tah-kew-shoo, Japan, October 2002. And okay, next is Nigel Brailey's introduction. In the longer run, and in a personal sense, it has to be said that Ernest Sato's transfer back to Tokyo in 1895 as Her Britannic Majesty's Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary was a misfortune. After 7 years away from Asia, in Uruguay and in particular Morocco, he was reconfirmed as an Oriental specialist who would never again be considered for a posting other than in the East. By contrast, his much more narrow-minded successor at Tangier, Arthur Nicholson, the future first Baron Carnock, was to be promoted in due course successively as ambassador to Spain and Russia, and end up as PUS, Permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, 1910 to 1916, and in the process play a not unimportant role in Europe's slide into war. Sato, meanwhile, was able merely to fortify in retirement his reputation as a scholar of broad compass, most notably of Western diplomacy, with his classic two-volume study of 1917, A Guide to Diplomatic Practice. Nevertheless, involvement back in the Far East, successively as minister in Tokyo and Beijing, gave Sato a platform during the decade 1895 to 1905, when the region's affairs were probably more important globally than at any time before or since. Subsequent to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, believing the region to be stabilized, the great powers of the West for the most part transferred their focus back to Europe in advance of the 1914-18 war, and did not seriously re-establish an awareness of Eastern affairs until the 1930s. In terms of the decade 1895 to 1905, the central event was the signing of the Anglo-Japanese alliance on the 30th of January 1902, although for various administrative and personal reasons it was not announced until 11th of February. By that time, Sato had been stationed in Beijing for some 15 months, but in many respects it can be seen as the culmination of his work in Japan in the years 1895 to 1900. On the British side, it has been seen as the first clear demonstration of an end to the isolation, splendid or otherwise, of which Tory governments under Lord Salisbury in particular had previously been so defiantly proud. On Japan's side, it has been widely claimed to mark its joining the Great Power Club, although a similar end of isolation is perhaps more accurate. It is questionable whether Japan ever gained great power status, and in 1894 few Japanese would have risked a war with Russia, already seen as their real enemy. In February 1904, however, 2 years after arranging the alliance with Britain, which secured her against a new European great power combination, it was Japan who took the initiative by attacking Port Arthur, Russia's principal naval base in the Far East. So the alliance gave Japan some security that if, say, for example, France should join in with Russia, then Britain would join in with Japan. The ambivalence of Satow's position in Japan during 1895 to 1900, prior to the signing of the alliance, is evident from the fact that he could obtain no explicit instructions from London despite his own best efforts. All he ever received from Lord Salisbury was one personal letter phrased very much in generalities 4 months after his arrival in Tokyo. That letter I have transcribed elsewhere. And this anticipated his similar experience when he transferred to Beijing following the suppression of the so-called Boxer Rebellion in 1900. In 1900, however, Lord Salisbury seems already to have been losing his grip, discomfited as he was by the outbreak of the rebellion, of which he had been given little effective warning, and he was shortly to be displaced as Foreign Secretary by Lord Lansdowne. In 1895, by contrast, Lord Kimberley, as Foreign Secretary in the previous Liberal administration, had stolen a march in the cause of improving Anglo-Japanese relations by appointing Sato to Tokyo on the very eve of the Liberals' loss of power. And it is conceivable that Salisbury, taking over at the Foreign Office on the very eve of Sato's departure, was in two minds whether to cancel his appointment. For that matter, it seems quite possible that had the Tories already been in power, they would have joined the European great power combination known as the Triple Intervention in April 1895, which stripped Japan of most of her gains from the war against China in 1894-95, a renewal of which always seemed to Sato to be on the cards. So the Triple Intervention was Russia, France, and Germany. If Britain had joined it, it would of course would have been the Quadruple Intervention, but it did not. That's counterfactual. Various factors doubtless contributed to Salisbury deciding, after all, to confirm Sato's appointment, and thereby his part in settling a resentful Japan's relations with the West down again following the war. But for as long as Lord Salisbury continued to run the Foreign Office, the chances of an Anglo-Japanese alliance, let alone the raising of Anglo-Japanese relations to ambassadorial level as happened finally in 1905, were effectively non-existent. Despite his own attempts and those of his Japanese counterpart in London, Kato Takaaki or Komei, to improve things throughout the years 1895 to 1900, Sato operated in an atmosphere of some coolness between London and Tokyo. Tories expected independent Asian polities to be subservient and showed a degree of sympathy for the plight of Siam, Thailand, and Persia, Iran, threatened respectively by French or Russian takeover, but they were already suspicious of Japanese ambitions. These diaries contain only limited reference to the rise of Japanese Pan-Asianism, let alone yellow perils, in this era of so much more concern to other European powers such as France, whose newspapers were replete by 1902 with reports of improving relations between Japan and Siam, even the unlikely prospect of a marriage alliance between the Japanese and Thai royal families. But there is much to indicate what such anti-Western inclinations fed upon. The Japanese were upset by growing restrictions on their emigration, like that of the Chinese, to British Columbia, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as California. They resented European diplomats touting for business, for instance, the purchase of Western-built warships. At the same time, they met with opposition to the appointment of their own consuls to British India to promote their trade with the jewel in Queen Victoria's crown. And the approaching termination of most aspects of the so-called unequal treaties dating back to the heyday of gunboat diplomacy, the 1850s, was prompting thoughts of a reversion to pre-1850s Sakoku isolation. Arriving not long after the signing of the groundbreaking new Aoki-Kimberley Treaty of July 1894, Sato had the job, supervised by the permanent officials at the Foreign Office rather than Lord Salisbury, to see this renegotiation and the end of Western semi-imperialist extraterritorial rights take effect, while keeping Japan on side within the Comity of Nations. For better or worse, failure in this respect would have eliminated any prospect of the alliance of 1902. Of course, even that alliance was originally envisaged in London as a three-sided affair, also involving Germany, of which the Anglo-German link would have been the most important, Ironically, being half German himself, Sato became by around 1909 quite anti-German, and even the triple intervention of 1895 he recognized as largely organized by Berlin against Japanese interests. Similarly, the scramble for concessions in China in 1897 to 98, which soon alarmed the Japanese with the prospect of the dissolution of the Middle Kingdom, was effectively launched through the German occupation of Kiaochou on the Shantung Peninsula. But in these years, Japanese attitudes, like those of Britain towards Germany, were quite mild. It was to be the breakdown of the negotiations between Britain and Germany in 1901, along with German criticism of the Boer War, that was to lead to closer ties between Berlin and St. Petersburg, making it the more likely that when the Great War came, both Britain and Japan would be on the opposite side to Germany. Finally, however, after a 9-year interval, the years 1895 to 1900 enabled Sato to resume his relations with his former musume, Japanese mistress or common law wife, and his 2 sons by her. He had continued to remit money to them from his other various postings, but was now able to take full responsibility for the boys, overseeing their education and later arranging for the tubercular Eitaro, Alfred, to emigrate to Colorado, and the younger Hisayoshi to study in England. Eitaro was to die in 1926, 3 years before his father, but Hisayoshi returned to Japan in 1915 to an academic career that lasted until after the Far Eastern War. Nigel Brailey, University of Bristol. Okay, just take a quick drink. Prologue, the new challenge. Sato returned as instructed from Morocco to London for a briefing at the Foreign Office and a brief respite before taking up his new appointment as British Minister in Japan. The first mention of Japan in the diary is when he was still in Morocco on May the 17th, 1895. May 17th, before dinner, came telegram that my appointment is accepted by Japanese government and will be made public tomorrow. You should come home as soon as you can arrange to leave, placing Mr. White in charge. May 27th, got to London at 5, Augusta and Sam Sato to meet me, sister and brother. May 28th, to Foreign Office and saw Sir Thomas Sanderson. 3 questions in the East. 1, what is Japan going to get for giving way about Liaotsung Peninsula in southern Manchuria? 2, Korea, where Japanese reforms are not accepted. 3, Formosa, or Taiwan as we know it, where the Chinese seem to be secretly sending arms to those who oppose Japan. War might break out again if this is true. Japan probably more exhausted than is usually thought. Sanderson said, I must go off to Japan as soon as possible. Gerard A. Lowther doing well as chargé d'affaires in the absence of a minister, but obliged to take his information from John H. Gubbins and Ralph S. Paget. Okay, so here are the footnotes for this page. Augusta Toza, née Sato, Samuel Sato, Thomas Henry Sanderson, Formosa, a beautiful island in Portuguese. Gerard Augustus Lowther had no knowledge of Japanese. John Harrington Gubbins was appointed student interpreter in the Japan Consular Service in 1871. There's his career there. Okay, and Ian Nish wrote about him in Britain and Japan Biographical Portraits, Volume 2, 1997. Next page, May 31st. Lord Kimberley says there are 2 confidential matters not to be mentioned to anyone. 1, that Kato showed him the dilatory answer Japan proposed to send to the 3 powers. 2, that after their first successes, when the Japanese wanted to break their agreement not to touch the Yangtze, HMG, Her Majesty's government, informed them in clear language that force would be used to prevent them. The government saw no reason for interfering about Formosa, though of course would rather they had not taken it. As to Liaotsung, that concerned Russia alone. Japan, our natural ally as against Russia. It seems likely that the latter will also call on Japan to surrender Korea, so that strife may yet arise from that. Remember, Lord Kimberley is a liberal, outgoing foreign secretary. He asked a good deal about Fez, the Sultan, and Bahamet, and said I had been most successful. That was in Morocco. Lunched with Win Stanley, who says I am sure to have a hearty welcome from British residents at Yokohama. I'm not sure who Winstanley was. I don't think I've ever got to the bottom of that. 1st of June. Kato and his secretary Ijuin came to see me. Kato says, action of Germany in joining Russia most unexpected. Also, why did not the powers object before the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed? Does not know what is being done about the indemnity. Chinese, according to the papers, are holding back, they think. French Foreign Minister Gabriel Anotot's officious summoning of the banks, very odd. Spoke very gratefully of the friendly advice given by Lord Kimberley. From Lord Kimberley, I learned the Japanese had asked advice and even help. He had observed that probably retention of Liaotsung would weaken Japan, just as possession of territory on the continent of Europe would harm England. Also, he understood from Lord Kimberley that special selection had been exercised in appointing me. I said I hoped my personal friendship with leading Japanese statesmen would render my task much easier. Yes, the triple intervention occurred just after the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed on April 17th, 1895. So more or less, it was 3 days, well, it was 3 days later that their powers objected. So why did they not object before the treaty was signed? Indeed, good question. Footnotes, Ralph Spencer Paget, Lord Kimberley, John Wodehouse, English liberal statesman, Kato Takaaki Okome, Japanese minister to Britain 1894 to 99, later foreign minister. Portrait by Ian Nish in Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, Volume 4. Her Majesty's government was the government of Queen Victoria. Britain was primarily concerned to safeguard her trading position in the east, centered on the port of Shanghai at the mouth of the Yangtze River. Yes. June the 11th. In the morning, discussed questions of Japanese scholarship with William George Aston. He read me Mrs. O'Neill's letter about her late husband's second volume, from which it seems that the manuscript is to be submitted to E.B. Tyler for his opinion as to whether it should be published or not. In the afternoon, drove with the Astons to Beer Head and walked over the top to a very beautiful view of the green Branscombe valleys lying secluded from the world. Picked out and marked in catalogue a certain quantity of Japanese historical and botanical books. So, yes, Beer is not far from Ottery St. Mary, where Satow eventually retired. June the 14th to 18th. At Oxford, called on Tylor's, asked Tylor about printing second volume of O'Neill's Night of the Gods. He agrees with me that the book is a wild one and does not recommend. He afterwards consulted Max Müller, who was of the same opinion. Promised to send them from Japan some out-of-the-way Siamese coin forms. 18th of June, dined with Algernon B. Mitford at the House of Commons and heard part of the Committee on the Disestablishment Bill. Was introduced to George Curzon by Mitford. Curzon, not quite satisfied with our relations with Japan, thinks the government have been hoodwinked. Told him of Kato's language at the dinner where I was a guest. 20th of June, dined with Winstanley at Thatched House Club, who had asked also W.G. Howell, F. Corns, F.V. Dickens, Alan Shand. Here are the footnotes. William George Aston, consular official. Algernon Bertram Mitford, later from 1902 Baron Redesdale. George Nathaniel Curzon. Frederick Corns. There's a biographical portrait by Peter Davies in Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, Volume 4. Frederick Victor Dickens. There is a biographical portrait of him by Peter Kornitsky in Chapter 6 of Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, Volume 3. Alexander Alan Shand was a Scottish banker, frequent correspondent with Satow in retirement since he lived quite close by. That's by the by. All right, 24th of June. Breakfasted with James Bryce, who seems rather glad that the government have gone out and was not in the least degree bitter. Called on Sir Robert Kennaway Douglas at the British Museum, who looked well and hearty. He says Sir Thomas F. Wade is breaking up. Regrets that the pistol shot fired at Li Hung-chang in Shimonoseki during treaty negotiations prevented the Japanese from marching on Peking. At 5 to Fedor Satow's to tea and make the acquaintance of Mr. Blakeney, the father of Vivers intended. Dr. Okamura of the Yokohama court was there also. He said he remembered when a small boy in 1867 going to see Charles Wergman and myself pass through Maizaka, dined quietly with the Alcocks. 25th of June, went to Pars, that's Pars Bank, and drew some money and said goodbye to Alan Shand. Shand was a banker at Pars. Received summons to dine at Windsor Castle, so had to send excuse to Kato, who had asked Anderson, Shaw, Noel Buxton, Edwin Arnold, and others to meet me, and went down by 6:30 train. Saburo, that's SATOW'S servant, manservant, at last moment had misunderstood about the breeches and stockings, and so I had to borrow from Lord E. Clinton, the master of the household. I had a very pleasant sitting room overlooking the long walk. The other guests were Lord Carrington, Lady Granville, Lady Victoria, Leveson Gower. Dinner at 9. Talk with Queen Victoria about Morocco. Then investiture with KCMG and kissing hands. Not literally kissing hands, by the way. It's merely a ceremony. Smoke after in billiard room. Back to London town on the 26th of June. 28th of June, afternoon to Lord Kimberley, who repeated a great deal of what he told me on 31st of May. 3 things had rather annoyed the Japanese. First, our stopping them going up the Yangtze. Second, false report about Admiral Fremantle having saluted Japanese fleet in such a way as to put Chinese on the qui vive. Third, Fremantle's attempt to put restrictions on the Japanese right of search. But all these now explained and forgotten. When Japanese received the joint demand of Russia, France and Germany to give up Liaozhong, that's the triple intervention, Kato came and told him of the proposed Japanese answer. Some footnotes here. Sir Robert Kenaway Douglas, Oriental scholar. Sir Thomas Francis Wade, British diplomat and sinologist. Li Hung Chang, the Chinese viceroy. And chapter 18 of A Diplomat in Japan. And Honma Saburo, Sato's devoted Japanese manservant until his death. Okay, so continuing with the diary, Kato came and told him of the proposed Japanese answer. He advised them to, next page, give way as Russia was in earnest, and they did so. He told the 3 powers of the advice he had given, and all parties had expressed their thanks. But the Japanese were furious with the Germans, and the Germans furious with the Russians for trying to do them out of a share in the loan. Germany and Her Majesty's government had represented to the Chinese government the undesirability of giving away the security of the Chinese customs for so small a sum, as it would prejudice the issue of the indemnity loan, and Japan also had been put up to the same, so it was likely that would fall through. Then he told me of his late conversation with Kato about the evacuation of Liaozhong, and he seems to have advised them not to be in a hurry to do so until they had sufficient guarantees for payment of the indemnity, etc. Also, he had talked to Kato confidentially about the desirability of a close understanding between Great Britain and Japan, but had not put this on record in dispatches to Lowther. He thinks Russians will press the Japanese to withdraw from Korea, and has said to Kato in reply to a question that he thought it might be well to recur to the proposal originally made by England at the outbreak of the war that the independence of Korea should be guaranteed by Russia and Great Britain, doubtless in conjunction with Japan. The Russian idea is to come across Manchuria to Port Lazarev, Wonsan, with their railway, and probably they would eventually get possession of that portion of Korea. But that would not suit us at all, and our policy ought to be a close alliance with Japan, the combined fleets being quite able to cope with the Russians, while the Japanese army would be most useful. Ukraine, anyone? The Chinese alliance would never be of any use unless they had been taken in hand by the Japanese and thoroughly drilled and taught on European systems. The Japanese at one time had thought of this, but had recognized its impossibility. Anyhow, China was unreliable and useless. We should keep on friendly terms with her, but not count on her as a factor against Russia. Aoki, that's Aoki Shuzo, when here last summer to negotiate the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of Commerce and Navigation, had told him they had gone to war because it was a question of now or never. They feared China falling under the influence of Russia and wanted to give her an awakening blow, what we would call a wake-up call. But that policy had not succeeded. He thought the English newspapers at Yokohama did a great deal of harm to our friendly relations with the Japanese. It was desirable to humor their vanity a little and cultivate their goodwill. it was no longer possible to treat them as semi-civilized. So here's a footnote about Aoki Shuzo, Britain and Japan Biographical Portraits, Volume 3. Again, Ian Nish wrote about him. It was no longer possible to treat them as semi-civilized, and to bully them, they must be treated on a footing of equality. I said that as to vanity, the Japanese greatly desired the Garter for the Mikado, and I told him what had happened in 1881 with the portrait of the Queen and offer of GCB, the Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath. This he agreed with me in thinking was a great difficulty. Then I said that being able to talk Japanese, I hoped to get their literary people, MPs and so on round me, and to make friends of non-official people as well. As I left, he said that the whole department had had a high opinion of me before, which was increased by the skillful manner in which I had managed things in Morocco. Went to leave a card on Kato and then out to dine at the Sato family home in the London suburb of Clapton. Augusta returned to Oxford. Margin note, saw Bertie, or Barty, I think, correctly pronounced, who says the French signed their delimitation agreement with China. N. O'Connor being in the next room, Lord Salisbury's advent to the Foreign Office seems to be welcomed by him and Wilde. 29th of June. Left Euston at noon. Sam, Charlie, Fedor, Kato, and Gowland to see me off. So family members, Sam and Charlie. Fedor, I think, is a cousin. Kato, the minister, Japanese minister, and Gowland. From England to Japan. So that's my subheading here. On June 29th, Sato left Liverpool, England for New York aboard the Lusania. After traveling across Canada, he left Vancouver for Japan on July the 15th in the Empress of China. Most of his short diary for the trip from England to Japan is here omitted as of limited interest, being a mere record of the journey via Niagara Falls and Toronto, where he joined the Canadian Pacific Railway. 15th of July, sailed from Vancouver in the Empress of China, Captain Archibald RNR, Royal Naval Reserve, a capital fellow. Pleasant Americans, P. Barlow and his wife, Reverend Dr. Nevins, Ashton Lindsay, an insurance company inspector, with these three and Dr. Graham of Delhi, is that Delhi in India, played whist all the way over. After also Reverend Dr. Ashmore and his wife, American missionaries at Swatow or Shantou, and Grinnan, who married a niece of Dr. James C. Hebburn, who pioneered the study of Japanese in the 1860s in Japan. Okay, footnote. It should be remembered that Kimberley had recently signed away the semi-colonial regime of extraterritoriality established by the Treaty of 1858 between the Earl of Elgin and the Tokugawa Bakufu in the Anglo-Japanese Commercial Treaty of 1894. The Garter was eventually awarded to the Emperor by a mission headed by HRH Prince Arthur of Connaught in 1906. See A.B. Mitford, the Garter mission to Japan, Macmillan, 1906. Sir Harry Parkes, then British minister, delivered the portrait of Queen Victoria to the Emperor and Empress on March 18th, 1882, with a reference to another essay by Ian Nish in Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, Volume 2. So arrival in Japan, again, this subheading is mine. 28th of July, cold voyage. From 17th to 25th, hardly ever saw the sun, and thermometer about 40 degrees to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Reached Yokohama in the afternoon, muggy and overcast, everything gloomy, dark green foliage. Address from British subjects, presented by Jock A. Fraser, who introduced Charles Wergman's caricature of me as the centre of our policy in Japan. Made a feeble speech in reply, laudatory of Sir Harry Parkes as the most devoted servant of his country and countrymen in the East. There were N.P. Kingdon, J.J. Keswick, A.J. Wilkin, J.H. Brooke, J. Ricketts, J.H. Bogue, G.H. Alcock, T. Thomas, Reverend Mr. Irwin, John F. Lauder, and a host of men whom I do not know. James P. Mollison came up to me at the station. Gerard Lowther, Harold G. Parlett, Alfred E. Wileman, and John C. Hall came on board. R.A. Mowat and Henry C. Litchfield were at the consulate. John H. Gubbins and Dr. Erwin von Belz at the station, and Joseph H. Longford at the house. Ralph S. Paget came down from Nikko and arrived after dinner. So then there's fairly lengthy footnotes about all those people. ERNEST Sato Koshi Nikki, translated into Japanese and annotated by Shozo Nagaoka for the period, begins here. So James Johnston Keswick, John Frederick Lauder, Harold George Parlett, Alfred Ernest Wildman, John Carey Hall, Robert, or is it Reginald Anderson Mowat, Henry C. Litchfield, Erwin von Belz, and Joseph Henry Longford. If you want to read the footnotes, please pause the video. 29th of July, called on Acting Minister for Foreign Affairs Sayonji Kinmochi, who talked French, said complimentary things about my having assisted in the restoration of 1868, also that Kato had transmitted to them the advice given by Lord Kimberley, which had proved of great service to the Japanese government. Left cards at the French legation and called on Orfini, the Italian chargé d'affaires. Lowther dined. 30th of July, called on E. Dunn, the American minister. Belz, Gubbins, and Wildman dined. Not died, dined. Excuse me. Katsu Inoue of the Japanese Foreign Office was sent to say that there was a doubt about my being received unless I had brought previous British Minister P.H. Le Peur Trench's letter of recall, so telegraphed to Foreign Office. August 1895, 1st of August. Went to call on Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi by appointment. We first talked about Morocco, and then I congratulated him upon the success of their arms by sea and land and on the peace negotiations, which had turned out so well for Japan. We talked a good deal about the Liaotsung Peninsula, and I wrote a dispatch afterwards about the conditions on which Japan is willing to give it up. Then the talk fell on Korea. He asked me whether England had any interest there. Commercially, I replied it was not of great importance, but we were anxious that what Japan was trying to prevent should not come about. In other words, that Russia should take over, I think. I asked whether it was the desire of Russia to bring their railway through Manchuria or to a port in Korea. He answered that what they aim at is something much greater than a port, and then went on to tell me confidentially that Hitrovo had visited Sayonji the day before, and after repeating as far as he could the language used by him, went upstairs and fetched down a memo, which he read to me, and afterwards I read it over so as to fix it in my memory. Telegraphed it all to Foreign Office. The gist was that Russia expected Japan to conform her acts to her declarations as to the independence of Korea, and asserting that King Kojong, okay, and here we have some notes, Sayonji Kinmochi, Edwin Dunn, and Ito Hirobumi. Asserting that the king, that's King Kojong, 1852 to 1919, ruled 1864 to 1907, is anxious to make reforms, but fears his authority will be weakened by Japanese interference. I remarked that the communication was couched in very polite terms, to which he responded that that was the Russian method of beginning very mildly, then gradually increasing in peremptoriness. I inquired whether Kato had reported a conversation he had had with Lord Kimberley about recurring to a proposal made by Great Britain at an earlier period of the war of the guarantee of Korean independence. He said yes. Then I remarked that it seemed to me advisable to join other powers besides Russia and Great Britain. Explained the relations between Great Britain, Spain, and Italy regarding the status quo in Mediterranean, and suggested that Italy would be very willing to join, also perhaps Austria. This is guaranteeing Korean independence. He, Ito, observed that it would be best to invite all the great powers, but it was not yet opportune. That independence of Korea would leave the question open, and he hinted that Russia would then be able to deal directly with Korea and obtain her aims more easily and securely. We agreed that neutralization was rather the term to employ than independence. He said the European Triple Alliance was not quite as solid as previously. Asked him if he knew why Germany had joined Russia and France. He said it was with the object of preventing their too intimate union. I said that Germany's action being prompted by a political necessity, she was probably not actuated by unfriendliness to Japan and might therefore be counted on for an arrangement with regard to Korea. He remarked that apparently the foreign representatives were not all of them in close touch with their governments. For example, on April 20th, German Minister Freiherr von Gutschmidt had telegraphed congratulations to him at Shimonoseki, and yet 2 days later he had joined him in the protest about the Liaotsung Peninsula. I said I had not yet seen Gutschmidt, but supposed him to be friendly, though perhaps less hearty than Italy. On this he said that Italy had exhibited a friendly disposition throughout. She had been invited to join in the protest, but had declined. Aoki had telegraphed that they should communicate their intentions about Korea to England, of course. but also to Baron Marschall von Bieberstein, the foreign minister of Germany, although the latter had not given any assurance of being disposed to assist them. For his own part, he feared to give his confidence to Germany, lest she should inform the other two powers. Although the Germans had at first been much annoyed at being left out of the financial arrangements, she had now been appeased by the invitation given by the French bankers to 4 Berlin financial houses to participate in the issue of the loan. In 1890, Yamagata Aritomo's Memorial on Foreign Policy had stated that Korea was within Japan's cordon of interest. Okay. Footnote there. August the 1st continued, said that I had also to congratulate him on the conclusion of treaty revision. I was glad to find on my return here that this question, which had occupied the two governments for so many years, was now out of the way. Inquired whether the Russian treaty would be signed. Ito said the emperor had already signed the ratification, that it is on its way out and will be exchanged irrespective of other negotiations. France and Germany were holding out, the former for some concessions in favor of French products and both of them for the right to hold real property. I said it seemed reasonable enough to let foreigners hold real property, as otherwise they could not put up substantial buildings with mere leases of 30 or 35 years. But in England, leases were usually 99 years at least. Ito replied that the difficulty lay with chambers, i.e. the upper and lower houses of the Diet, and not with the government. About Formosa, he said that the want of proper roads prevented transport of troops and guns, while the port down south is bad and landing difficult at this time of year. But during the present month, they will be sending 40,000 men, 2.5 divisions, in addition to the 1.5 divisions they already have there. Sir Robert Hart had asked through Hayashi Tadasu, then Japanese minister in China, that protection might be afforded to the keepers at a lighthouse on the south end of Formosa, and he had telegraphed to Kabayama to send down a ship. It appeared that the lightkeepers were in fear of the Chinese as well as the savages. The latter had been forced into opposition to the imperial troops. August 5th, called on Kawakami Chiujo, but did not find him. Went to Saionji, asked about my audience, but he could not tell me, as Inoue Katsunosuke had not come, but it would not be long. That would be the audience with the emperor, I think. Korea. Ito had told him what he had said to me on the subject, and he had also telegraphed to Lord Salisbury through Kato for his advice. As to Liao Tsung, Lobanov had informed Nishi that they were not satisfied with the last answer, that 50 million taels was too much, and they wished Japan to hasten the withdrawal of their troops. The German government apparently did not share this view, but he thought France desired to join Lobanov. Lobanov had added that a communication would be made to the Japanese government through Hitrovo. I said 50 million was a sum the Chinese would have difficulty in raising, as the £16 million loan would be absorbed by the 2 payments of 50 million demanded. Saionji observed that this was what we had frequently suggested to them before. Then I told him the Russians are supposed to suspect them of wishing to hold on to the peninsula permanently. Saionji said he thought they should take measures to remove these suspicions. The number of troops now left in Manchuria is only about Ichishidan, 1 division, though nominally there are 2, one having gone to South Formosa, and the garrison of Weihaiwei. This is a note on Sir Robert Hart. The garrison of Weihaiwei having been supplied from Manchuria. This was a small force for so large a territory. I remarked that hitherto they had only exchanged verbal declarations, but perhaps what was necessary was an exchange of notes. I urged him about duty on Formosan sugar. He said it had been referred to the Treasury. He thought it natural not to levy duties, but could not say what arrangements were going to be made about the island. Also about the Islam. He said that was going to perhaps to be a big question. I said not, but of course, as our neutrality had been infringed, we were obliged to protest, and the note of Lowther of July 1895 having been written under instructions from Lord Kimberley, I wanted an answer that would satisfy Lord Salisbury. Privately, I thought they should say it was a mistake and that they regretted, but that he must regard as an unofficial opinion. He begged me to be particular, not to repeat to anyone what he had told me about Korea and the peninsula, complained of being overworked with 2 departments. I also mentioned to him the rumours of massacres in Formosa, on which Saturday's Gazette has an article, and deplored the hastiness with which the newspaper press in general adopts any rumour that reaches it without taking any trouble to inquire into the facts. Returned calls of several people, among them Date Munenobu, late Uwajima, who speaks English. Sister is Princess Kitashirakawa. His wife is Princess Komatsu Kurume. Also Date Muneatsu Baron, son of Date Muneki, whose wife is a daughter of old Matsune Toyo, very nice woman. Longford and Gubbins went off to the country again. Lowther dined. 6th of August. Drove with Paget to the Shokubutsuen plant shop and bought some plants. Also some kamagiri, praying mantises, green stick-like insects, from a man in the street. 7th of August to Yokohama. Did some shopping and lunched with the Halls, who have 6 children, called on the Moats. Left cards on M.J. Hunt and the Thomases. Then to Brooks to see Madame Ueda, I suppose. Ojeda? Saw Mrs. Brooke and Mrs. S. John. Then to tea with Mrs. J.J. Keswick and to the Bonars. Promised to ask the latter to dine with me next week. Train's very late owing to crowds visiting the Chen Wen, a captured Chinese capital ship at Yokosuka. 8th of August, called on Gutschmidt and Danetan. So a note about the Islam and Baron Danetan. Please pause if you want to read those. Pause the video. 9th of August. Audience of Emperor and Empress, to which I was fetched by Niwa Ryonosuke, a master of the ceremonies, in one of the imperial carriages about 20 minutes before 10, the hour fixed for the audience. Date Munenobu, Nagasaki, Sannomiya, Fukui, and 1 or 2 others were there. Saionji, who was to present me, came late, saying that he had thought 10:30 was the hour. The waiting room is large and handsome. Viscount Kagawa Keizo, an old acquaintance who is the Empress's Grand Master of Ceremonies, also made his appearance. There was a little waiting outside the reception room while the Emperor was coming in, and then I was introduced into it, made my 3 bows, and standing about 4 feet from the Emperor, read my speech in English, which was translated from memory by Nagasaki. The Emperor replied from memory too, and then paused. This was the formal part acknowledging the Queen's letter. Then he added other words which, as translated from the Japanese copy brought to me afterwards by Nagasaki, were as follows. We are exceedingly gratified to think that a greater cordiality in the friendly relations existing between our respective countries will be facilitated by the fact of your many years' residence in our country and by your thorough knowledge of our national affairs. I thanked him in a short sentence. It's very similar to the sort of exchanges that occur in the present day between the Emperor and the King and so on, as we've seen quite recently. The Emperor, Meiji, that is 1852 to 1912, ruled 1868 to 1912, looked much stouter in the face than when I last saw him in 1884, and spoke rather indistinctly, so that I could not well catch what he said, and it was a great convenience to have Nagasaki to interpret. Then I backed out in the usual manner and was taken along the side of the reception room, and turning a corner was introduced to the Empress, who was dressed in European clothes and gloves. She gave me her hand and then said, I am glad to see you again after so many years. To this I replied through one of the 2 ladies in waiting that I thanked Her Majesty for her gracious words. Then she asked how long I had been away from Japan, and I answered in Japanese that I had left 12 years ago and had previously been 20 years in the country. Her next remark was to express her belief that my appointment would tend to draw closer the bonds of friendship, to which I replied that I should always do my best to promote that object. Then she said that she understood I was a great scholar in Japanese things, to which I replied that I was very unlearned, had been absent so long that I had lost the power of speaking, and feared I might have said rude things. Then she put out her hand again, and I shook it, bending low over it, almost as if to kiss it, and bowed myself out. Afterwards, Sanomiya said it had gone off very nicely, and that I had spoken very well, and they congratulated me. I responded that I was greatly pleased with the gracious manner of my reception, which indeed was very cordial. After that, the masters of ceremonies accompanied me to the carriage, and Niwa brought me back to the legation. In the afternoon, paid visits to all the ministers of state, with the exception of Oyama Iwao, whose residence is so far that I could not get there in time. British military attaché, Captain Noel du Boulay, Paget, and Wildman dined. August 10th, Count Higashi Kuze Michitomi, Vice President of the Privy Council, and Viscount Hijikata Hisamoto, Minister of the Imperial Household, called. Both very cordial, the latter particularly so. He talked of alliance between Japan and England, of the disadvantage of a certain power, Russia, getting hold of Gensan, i.e. Wonsan, also called Port Lazarev in Korea. Asked him about Ito and Yamagata Aritomo, former Prime Minister, receiving their promotion. He said it was true. In these cases, men are never asked beforehand, and they had both declined, but Yamagata, he was sure, would finally accept. He had been down to Yokohama on the previous day to see Ito, and that point too he thought must be arranged. Called on Marquis Oyama Iwao of Satsuma, see footnote on page 292, in the forenoon, who returned it in the afternoon. He said Manchuria was a rich province, and the people quiet-tempered. Of the Koreans he spoke with contempt and dislike. Called on Katsuawa, who is rather deaf in consequence of some head trouble. This is Katsukaishu. Talked very much in his old style, as if the present statesmen were children, and gave me a copy of a big book in 3 volumes, which he has written on the opening of Japan from Perry's arrival down to about 1867. Called on Count Kawamura Sumiyoshi, Privy Councillor, who is friendly as of old, his son a nice youth who has been in England. August the 11th, Miyamoto Okazu, former chief accountant at Foreign Ministry, called. Thinks Ito is probably tired of office. Just before the Sino-Japanese War broke out, he was contemplating some such step, but that kept him from taking it. Some such step. Resignation, is that? Date Munenori, also read Mune-e, the ex-daimyo of Uwajima, called. Says his 4th son is in Germany and asked for money to make a trip through France and England before returning home. Drove to Reverend Theodore Munro McNair's house to inquire about Oyae, but found he had gone to Karuizawa in Nagano Prefecture to escape the heat of Tokyo. Dined tete-a-tete with Ralph Paget. August 12th, went to Yokohama and lunched there with Paget and lawyer A.B. Walford, who had acted for Japan in the Chishima case, to the latter of whom I delivered Fedor Sato's message. Fedor Sato was a lawyer, in fact, and had been in Japan. Met Spanish Minister Don José de la Rica there and went to his hotel, where he gave me a copy of the declaration defining Japanese and Spanish spheres. Spheres of influence, that would be. He said England was, of course, interested in checking the advance of Japan. For his own part, it seemed to him that much nonsense had been talked about Japan acquiring the Philippines and Dutch colonies. As to the former, the Tagals and other natives would certainly not prefer, and here are 2 footnotes, Count Katsuawa Yasuyoshi, Katsukaishu, and Enatsu Yae, Yae-san, Willis's Japanese wife. As to the former, the Tagals and other natives would certainly not prefer the Japanese yoke to Spanish domination, and would fight rather than yield to it. Japan perhaps had been directed by Providence in her annexation of Formosa, where she was going to learn a lesson that might check her ambition. England, he knew, was an advocate of the status quo in Morocco as elsewhere, and in the East would exercise the function of a controlling and moderating power. He also alluded with surprise to the extraordinary language attributed to Ito by an American interviewer, Colonel Cockerill, New York Herald special correspondent, with regard to the weak and corrupt character of the Spanish administration of the group. Called also on the new military attaché and on Jose Caro, the secretary. They are also to have a naval attaché, and he has permission to build a legation at Tokyo. Called on Russian minister Hitrovo, who talked a great deal and professed great admiration for the Japanese. In the train, talked with Sonoda Kokichi and Okura Kihachiburo. Speaking of the early date at which I came to Japan, Sonoda said that Ito had a hand in the burning of the legation on Gotenyama at Shinagawa in Edo on the 31st of January, 1863. And young Date the other day said the same thing, with the addition that Ito had spent the night squatting in a straw hut used for covering liquid manure. Ito has refused the rank of Marquis and the Grand Cordon announced on August the 5th, and coupled with this, according to Francis Brinkley's paper Japan Mail, his resignation, unless he is allowed to decline his honours. August 13th, Yamagata called, has accepted the Grand Cordon and the Marquisate. Said the cabinet, old friends, were all glad to have me here. Went to Saionji. Nothing new from either Nishio Kato, and the 3 colleagues, Russian, French and German, did not go to the Foreign Office last week. Japan would like to hear something by way of a reply, as she wants to settle with China. Ito came back today at noon, but was not present not present at the council, which was occupied in discussing the question of his refusal. It must have been a long one, as it began at 10 and was apparently only just over. Yamagata must have come from it, and he came about 2. But there is no question of his resigning. I said a few words about the importance of his remaining at the present juncture. The official notification about Italian treaty delayed because they don't know how to make him sign as Count or Marquis. It will be settled in 2 or 3 days. Asked what quantity of troops left in Manchuria. Answer, 2 corps d'armée, about 30,000. But by the end of the month to be reduced to 1. To Formosa, 45,000, 2.5 divisions are going to be sent in all. Inquired about Kabayama's proclamation, said he had not seen it. I said I attached no importance to what the newspapers said, but was anxious to know the exact facts for the information of Her Majesty's Government, HMG. He promised to inquire and let me know. Also made a remark about Cockerill's letter to New York Herald regarding Government of Manila, which I did not. Here's another footnote about Francis Brinkley. Government of Manila, which I did not think Ito could have said. Correspondents were dangerous people. That is, who is it? Sayonji, I think we're talking to. Yes, Sayonji. Sayonji replied that Ito generally was on his guard, but sometimes spoke out freely. Of course, I said, this is between you and me. Told him I should go into the country as soon as I had seen the princes. Misunderstanding me, he said the crown prince, later Emperor Taisho, was very ill, and moreover too young to receive. Dined with Dubule to meet Oyama and members of his staff, among them Nodzu Shizutake, second son of Yoshii Kosuke, Ijichi Kurose Furukawa, a commissariat officer. 14th of August, Viscount Fukuba Yoshi Shizu, also known as Bisei, the dwarf Shintoist, called with his son Hayato, talked a good deal about the expansion of Japan, beginning from the time of Jimmu Tenno's start from Hyuga in Miyazaki, Kyushu. Even during the Tokugawa regime, the development of Oshu, northern Honshu, went on. I remarked that Iemitsu's closing the country to foreign intercourse showed his weakness in that direction. Called on Princes Komatsu Akihito and Yorihito at the official residence of Prince Kitashirakawa. The latter, who was in England 2 years ago, speaks English and asked me to tell them at home how vividly he remembered the kind reception he had from the Queen and Prince of Wales. J.P. Reed of Strawn's, brother of Sir Robert Reed, the Queen's private medical attendant, called. Kawamura Sumiyoshi returned my call. Quite impossible to get anything out of him about the rumored resignation of Ito. He said that at one time Navy Minister Marquis Saigo Tsugumichi had a party of his own and spoke of boycotting as being practiced by the Japanese against each other. I mentioned to him the Korns Kimura case, a dispute with Kimura Shoten over yarn imported by Korns and Company, arising July 1894, settled by arbitration on July 20th, 1895, as having caused much comment at Yokohama. The Bonars and Wileman dined. 15th of August, Saigo called. This will be Saigo Tsugumichi. He said he was going off to Numazu by the 11 o'clock train. I had to ask him to excuse me as I had an engagement with Prince Kanin. The latter has Hanabusa for his Grand Master, who has grown a beard and looks quite old. After about 2 minutes, I recognized him. The prince, who is young, was accompanied by the princess, a very pretty young woman in Japanese dress. They conversed very freely and affably on all sorts of subjects. So we've got footnotes: Fukuba Bisei, Komatsu Akihito, Kain no Miya. They conversed very freely and affably on all sorts of subjects: his travels, the length of my previous stay in Tokyo, the alteration in the appearance of the town, his campaign at Haicheng in southern Manchuria, the condition of the Chinese battleship Chenyuan, which he had been to see yesterday, in Yokosuka, that is. Why Ishimaki, a nephew of former shogunate official Tsukahara Tajima no Kami, came. He wants to leave his present employment in the accountant's office at Shimbashi, where he gets $24 a month. Can speak and write English fairly well and says he has a good knowledge of Chinese classics. Threatening letter announcing intention to remove the Mikado's dishonest ministers and burn Tokyo to facilitate their plans. If I divulge them and so frustrate their plans, I shall be cut in two. Exclamation mark. August 16th to 18th at Miyanoshita, Hakone. See Baroness Duneton's diary, 14 years of diplomatic life in Japan, London 1912, for her first impression of Sato. August 17th, Armand came over, went to lunch with the Longfords and called on Madame Armand. Coming back, met Moet, B.H. Chamberlain, Basil Hall Chamberlain, came back from his trip to Fuji, Mount Fuji. Left card on Mutsu at Oiso, 16th. August the 18th, came back to Tokyo with R.A. Wiley of Korns and Company, R.M. Sterling and C.W. Ewer. August 19th, called on Ito as to his honors, as far as I could gather from his talk about it. The fact that he had not been consulted beforehand about the list of people to become marquises was the cause of his objecting, the object being to let them know that they must not again do things of the sort behind his back. Liaotsung Peninsula. Since the 9th, he has heard nothing. Nishi, the Japanese minister in Moscow, saw the foreign minister Lobanov, who said he was expecting a telegram from somewhere. It could hardly be France or Germany, probably China that caused the delay. Formosan sugar. He said at first that it was a difficult question, but I explained that it seemed odd to levy duties on goods sent from one part of the Japanese dominions to another. This he admitted and said he would suggest to the Commercial Bureau of the Foreign Office that as South Formosa was not yet subdued, they should accept British consul's declaration that the sugar came from Formosa, as of course there was no guarantee that it did not come from elsewhere. I added that of course what had already been paid would be refunded on production of evidence that it was Formosan's sugar. Formosa, Taiwan, alleged atrocities. I said I had spoken to Saionji, and that as the reports in the papers here might be telegraphed home and produce a wrong impression, as in the case of Port Arthur, I was anxious to be able to tell Her Majesty's government the real facts. He said he had not seen among the papers the proclamation attributed to Kabayama, but would look into the matter. A note on Mutsu Munemitsu. Would look into the matter and furnish me with copies of all that had been issued. Increase of taxes on sake for Army and Navy and current expenditure. 3 yen per koku of sake, raising it from 4 to 7, would give them 10 million yen, and the transference of the business patents, shigyose, from local taxation to imperial, national was the word he used, would give 5 million to 6 million more. The new construction would be provided from other sources. Kimura Corns had heard of this from Sanomiya. It was very wrong of the Yokohama Foreign Yamen Weaving Dealers Guild, but these bodies were private associations, not under government control. I suggested that a word from him would prevent a repetition of such incidents, justice being administered in the name of the sovereign. To refuse to be bound by the decision of a judge was equivalent to denying the Mikado's authority. He admitted that this sort of thing was most undesirable. Crown Prince, according to Imperial Household Dr. Erwin von Beltz, very ill. In fact, there was every sign of his disease amounting to consumption. Illegible. Meningitis, and possibly some tuberculosis had become encysted, had been stimulated into revived action by his lack of typhoid. Wrote to ask Sanomiya whether I should go and call, and as he replied yes, drove there and wrote my name. The courtyard was strewn with sand, and I was asked to get out at the front gate and walk up, which I did. Went to Fujimicho before dinner. This is Japanese family, SATOW'S family. August 20th, by 9 o'clock, train to Nikko. Called on the EC Barlows at Kanaya, who officiously took possession of my things, trying to make me stay the night, but I determined to push on. George Dare and his wife left at 4 in Kuruma. Called on Coudenhove, who was out, but I found his Japanese wife, Aoyama Mitsuko. Brinkley and wife, Miss Florie Denning, daughter of British Minister Walter Denning, Chevalier de Kutski and his wife. Left there at 4:20 and reached Umagaishi at 5:40, mostly walking. Off again at 6:10 in the rain, and got to Chuzenji in the dark somewhat before 8. House rented from Ito Asajiro, small and not very comfortable. Dined with Lowther's Gutschmidt there. August 21st, dined with Gutschmidt. Says he does not think Germany will consent to new treaty coming into operation at the same time as ours, i.e. it will contain a 5 years clause, not 4 years like the Russian. German subjects sent strong memorial to their government. He has told Ito that the German government has to proceed very cautiously in arranging a commercial treaty for fear. Here are the notes for this page. Fujimicho 4 in Tokyo was where Sato's Japanese family lived. It's between the present Hosei University Library and Yasukuni Shrine, marked by a plaque. Count Heinrich Coudenhove Kalergi, Austrian Chargé d'Affaires in Tokyo. Walter Denning, and in the Chuzenji diary, the house is described as small and not very comfortable near the outfall of the lake. Ito Asajiro was a local ryokan owner. So he has told Ito that the German government has to proceed very cautiously in arranging a commercial treaty for fear Reichstag should refuse to ratify, as they have already given much trouble in regard to other treaties. agreed with me that Japanese are rather flattered than otherwise that in the Liao Tsung question, though forced to retrocede, they have been treated as if they belonged to the European concert. He told Lowther a few days ago that he had no instructions to inform Japanese that German government considered the conditions satisfactory, but had let them know it privately through Denison. He said Hitrova had been very open with him throughout and had assured him he had said nothing to Japanese about Korea, ! 29th of August, came down from Chuzenji with Parlett, walked to Arais Hotel, a Western-style hotel opened in 1892, used by many foreigners, in about 2 hours. Had received telegram from O'Connor, the British minister in Peking, asking me to urge the Japanese to demand the opening of Wuchou. 30th of August, went to Ito. He seemed at first to think Wuchou was up the Yangtze, but called head of political affairs at FO Komura Jutaro, chargé d'affaires at Peking when the Sino-Japanese War broke out, who put him right. After some talk, got him to agree to what I asked. Says Matsugata's reason for resignation as finance minister was a mere pretext. There was never any idea of asking for more than a budget of 16 million yen. He had been intending to resign for some time past. Crown Prince, later Emperor Taisho, in a very bad state of health. Doctors say he can never recover. It is a slow decline and he will never be able to study. He may last some time, but there can be no recovery. John F. Lauder and interpreter and consular court recording clerk W.J. Kenny called on the Korean minister. Daneton, Du Boulay, and Parlett dined. News of Li Hongchang's supersession as Viceroy of Chile and taking of Taiwan Fu, or Anping, received. August 31st, Ito came, says it all hangs on the reply of the three powers to Japanese conditions about Liao Tsung. He's very anxious to get it speedily. Yesterday, when he told me this, I suggested unwise to display too much anxiety. Says war has cost them 180 million yen up to the present, of which 20 million in coin taken out of the treasury, where they had a surplus of 34 million. Only 80 million of bonds issued. Coin expended, already nearly all replaced. Taiwan Fu taken, no further serious difficulty at present. Went to Hara Takashi, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, who promised answer for Admiral Buller about torpedo practice in Mororan Bay by Monday. Muroran is in Hokkaido. Also asked me to let him know whether it would be necessary to reissue our shooting, that is hunting, regulations, as the imperial decree had been turned into a statute. Said I would let him know, but not desirable to increase such notification. 3 short notes: Denison, Wuchou, and shooting regulations. Korean minister returned my call of yesterday and repeated his desire for advice. Told him I was a person of mean intelligence, but would do my best for him. Left card on Dutch minister resident Count de Bijland, it being the Dutch Queen's birthday. Bijland, I'm not sure. September 1895, September the 1st, had telegraphed to the Foreign Office and O'Connor the gist of my 2 talks with Ito, from whom a reply came back that the Chinese cannot pay 50 millions and if they pay will demand reduction of amount. Wrote my name at the Crown Prince's, who is much better, and returned the call of Tsuda Sen, who talked of lending certain woodblocks for coloured prints of convolvulus to the Asiatic Society for publication. Danetan called on his way back to May-Oct. That's Danetan is the Belgian minister. Wildman and Parlett to dinner. September 2nd, returned with Parlett to Chuzenji. See the Chuzenji diary. September the 5th, climbed Shirane-san from Yumoto with Barlow and Parlett. Parlett and I reached the top of Maijirane in 2 hours, waited half an hour for Barlow, who did not overtake us, and got to the summit in 3.5 hours easily. The view all round was quite clear. Saw Mount Fuji, the top of the Koshu Shirane range, Akagi-san, Nantai, Nyohozan, Omanago, Taro, and a host of other mountains. Left the top at 9:15 and got back at 1:05, having lunched on the way. It was a very fatiguing excursion. Indeed, I'm sure it was. September the 6th, left 6:38 and reached Shizu at 9:05. Off again at 9:25 and reached summit of Mount Nantai at 11:53. Rather slow as Barlow pumped. He and I took 2 hours to descend over a very bad patch, but Parlett did it in 1 hour, 7 minutes, much less tired than today. Okay. 10th of September, came down from Nikko and went to see Ito at 5. Told him of O'Connor's telegram and Lord Salisbury's, and found that he had received similar information from Berlin, St. Petersburg, and Peking, with addition that Japan would be asked not to delay the evacuation for conclusion of commercial treaty and payment of the Peninsula indemnity. We spoke also of Formosa. He said, by the way, that perhaps it might not be possible to treat Chinese who elected to remain in Formosa as Japanese subjects on the same footing as Japanese in criminal matters. I assured him that in Hong Kong and Singapore we made no exception against Chinese. As to Flint Kilby and Company's Formosan sugar, he repeated his promise of the 19th of August. Paget, Nevin, who came to stay from Bangkok, and T.S. Black dined. 11th of September, Dubule, Cavendish, Wildman dined. Saigusa Yosaburo, formerly my servant Yokichi at time of the revolution, and later founder of Saigusa Shoten Haberdashery in Ginza, came to call, bringing a box of cigars, and to ask me on behalf of Yokoyama Magoichiro, co-founder of Okura Gumi Trading Company with Okura Kihachiro in 1873, not to let Takaoka Kaname come up here because he is not fit for employment, and if I give him none, he will become a burden on Yokoyama. I said, all right. It seems that he is much in debt, and having used the 10 yen I sent him for travelling expenses, has now written to Yokoyama to ask for more. Colonel Edward Wright of Salvation Army, 1861 to 1947, in Japan, 1895 to 99, came. Wanted an introduction to some Japanese authority to whom he could explain object of the army. Told him I could not do more for him than any other British subject. David Jackson and T.S. Baker of Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank came to ask if I could put them in the way of sharing in financing of the remittance to Japan of the Chinese indemnity. Said I would try to get them an introduction to Ito. 12th of September, went to Gutschmidt to ask about Kobe proposed cholera regulations. Approves and will tell his consul to work with British Consul James J. Ensley. Formosa has also been told that there are 7 British and 2 Germans at Takao and 2 British missionaries at Anping. Kabayama would give timely notice of any intended attack. This is what Ito told me day before yesterday. Storm damage at Kobe, doubts whether Japanese could be held responsible. The 3 colleagues delivered messages from their governments about Liaotsung yesterday. 13th of September, went to Saionji, Kobe cholera regulations. He fetched in his secretary, young Motono Ichiro, with the report from the Chiji, the prefectural governor of Hyogo, and said he thought they would be glad to have a notification rendering them obligatory on British subjects, and would let me know if possible in the evening. I said I had sent them to my legal advisor at Yokohama to draft a notification. Liaotsung, he said the 3 colleagues had said the indemnity should not exceed 30 million, and that the question ought to be arranged independently of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Consequently, the latter could not be made to depend on payment of indemnity or conclusion of commercial treaty. They asked that a definite date should be fixed, the evacuation to take place as soon as the special indemnity was paid, but O'Connor telegraphed that it must not depend on payment of extra indemnity. Sugar. Volunteered information that the matter was being considered by the Bureau of Legislation, Hosei Kyoku, which caused the delay in giving a reply to my note of July 29th. Formosa reported massacres, told him that according to Hopkins' report of August the 2nd, the figures were nothing like the 2,000 spoken of, which were due to Chinese exaggeration. He expressed his satisfaction. I remarked that many Chinese had left in consequence of not being, then we got 2 notes, Takaoka Kaname, a physician from Wakayama, and of the 55,000 cholera patients in the sudden outbreak of 1895, as many as 40,000 died. Incredible numbers. Okay. He expressed his satisfaction. I remarked that many Chinese had left in consequence of not being able to smoke opium. Saionji, I think we're talking to Saionji, aren't we? Yes. Yes. Saionji said this was a difficult question. Would it be safe to let them smoke opium? For Japanese might contract the habit. I said that according to report of the British Opium Commission, opium did not work so much harm as alcohol, and they had not recommended its prohibition lest worse things should happen. Travellers had observed that many Chinese labourers used it daily in moderation. That was like the use of alcohol in Western countries. Outdoor labourers seldom exceeded. It was domestic drinking in secret that did the harm. For my own part, I wished both opium and alcohol could be done away with. 16th of September, returned to Chuzenji with Parlet. At Nikko, left a card for Mrs. Bishop. 17th of September, morning, rowed Gutschmidt's boat in 12 minutes over to Tozawa, where my house is to be built. Afternoon, sailed to Shobugahama, and walked with the Lowthers and Parlet to Ryuzugataki to dig ferns and tea at Shobunohama. 18th of September, Miss Gibson gave a picnic at Yumoto to the Lowthers, Miss Gordon, Parlet, and self. Took the path left beyond Ryuzunotaki to Senju, and turning to the right in swamp halfway there, took a path that brought us into Yumoto Path, a short way from the point where the latter leaves Senjogahara to Shobugahama to tea. Lowthers dined. 19th of September, telegram in the afternoon from Hall to say that the Admiral Buller was expected that day, so started with Parlet to walk to Nikko a little after 6 in the dark, followed by a policeman with a lantern. It took us 2.25 hours to Araya. That's Arai's hotel, I think. Saw Mrs. Bishop at Kanaya's hotel. Elizabeth Bird Bishop. 20th of September, down to Tokyo by 7:30 train. Admiral Buller with his Flag Lieutenant Bradshaw came up. He has received instructions to make a demonstration before Nanking and Wuchang, but cannot make out 1 or 2 groups in the last telegram which appear to contradict the other portion. It reads, consider would not be, when to make sense it ought to be the other way. He has, however, 6 ships up the Yangtze at different points and 2 at the mouth, lent him various North China heralds. Satisfactory to see that Her Majesty's government are making a resolution to deal with China properly. We talked a good deal about the relative character of the 2 nations, and I agreed that China is hopeless in the matter of reform, that a Chinaman does not know what patriotism is, the government system thoroughly rotten, Japanese per contra full of loyalty and fighting power, able to make war on a minimum of provisions. He agrees with me that both Liao Tsung and Formosa were blunders on the part of the Japanese, who will have to give way to dictation about Korea as well. September 21st, went down with Paget and Parlet to lunch with Buller. We got 2 footnotes or 3 footnotes. Mrs. Bishop was the married name of Isabella Lucy Bird, the lady traveller. In the Chuzenji diary, the boat is described as having an outrigger for extra stability, and the modern day names are Shobugahama and Ryuzunotaki. Okay, Logan, his captain, went down with Paget and Parlet to lunch with Buller on September the 21st. Logan, his captain, Pullen, secretary, and Henderson of the Edgar, also HMS Edgar. Called on the Halls, Lowthers, St. John's, and left a card on the surgeon of the Naval Hospital. September 22nd, went for a walk from Meguro with Kirkwood. During my absence, Captain S.H. Login of Centurion and Pullen's secretary called. Buller writes he's off tomorrow, as HMG have accepted O'Connor's representations that a demonstration on the Yangtze will do good. September 23rd, Bales says Mutsu is worse in consequence of having come to Tokyo contrary to his advice. The Crown Prince better and ought shortly to go to Zushi near Kamakura and then recommence his studies. We spoke of the desirability of his having a foreign tutor and learning English. He will have one lung partly damaged, the lower part of the right one. Drove to Mutsu to leave a card of inquiry. Dined with the Bickersteths, Mrs. Bishop, née Bird, staying there. The T.H. James is also. I think Mutsu died in this year or the following year. September 24th. Went to consult with the Bishop, Bickersteth, perhaps, about certain private matters. Mrs. Bishop, Isabella Bird, came to tea, and we had a long talk about various things. Reverend A.E. Webb of St. Andrews, Shiba, and Reverend W.C. Gemmell arrived about the same time. Vice Admiral Ito left a card. September 25th, went to Saionji at 3, who said they had almost finished conferring between Foreign Office, Finance Department, and Legislation Bureau about Kilby's sugar, and that he believed the duty would be refunded. He hoped shortly to give me an answer. Called on Baroness Danetan and met there her cousin Norwood C. Young, who is travelling in Japan. Dined at Kirkwood's. Reverend Lionel Berners Chumley, 1858 to 1945, the only other guest. September 26, went to Ito at 4 and had a long talk about Liaotsung Peninsula, Korea, constitutional government, and the reforms in the direction of lowering the franchise with a view to multiplying the electorate and the adoption of the ballot. Nichinichi's army scheme asked him to receive D. Jackson. That was the banker from Hong Kong and Shanghai. Norwood C. Young, Reverend L.B. Chumley, Duboulet, Paget, and Parlet dined. In the margin, Kurtgen and 2 others called to ask about O'Connor's movements. Kurtgen represents Barrow Construction and Armament Company. September 27th, called on Mrs. Gubbins, the Bickersteths, Tomita Tetsunosuke, 1835 to 1916, diplomat, Bank of Japan president, Tokyo governor. Mrs. Longford, Lowthers and Longfords dined. September 29th, went to Reverend T.M. McNair's house and saw Enatsuya Oyae, to whom I suggested a plan for obtaining a separation from her brutal husband. Dined at the Lowthers. Miss Gibson, Miss Divers, Goodsmith and Kirkwood were there. All right. Footnotes there. Pause if you want to read them. William Kirkwood. September 30th, went to Yokohama to pay calls, saw Mrs. Wheeler and A.J. Wilkin. Mrs. Bishop in the train going to catch her steamer for Shanghai on her way to Korea. Called at Grand Hotel to ask for A.G.S. Hoare's friends, Mrs. Clark and Miss Layton, who had that morning started for Nagoya. October 1895. 1st of October, Ishibashi Masataka came, has 87 copies of the dictionary, an English-Japanese dictionary of the spoken language, first edition 1876, left, which he will send to Kelly and Company. Said that clearly one half of the proceeds of the dictionary recently paid to me by Kelly and Company belonged to him as co-author, so later on in the day sent him a check for $135. Edward Moon MP called, asked him to dinner, the Gubbins also, and Dubule and Parlett. 2nd of October, left card on Count Inoue Kaoru, former foreign minister. 3rd of October, Goodschmidt came to ask what instructions I had given about proposed cholera regulations at Kobe. Read him my dispatch to Ensley and told him the opinion I had expressed to Komura. He agreed. He thinks the Liaotsung business will soon be settled. China will be induced to pay 80 million taels on 8th of November, taking the 30 million out of what was subscribed in Paris and Petersburg. As to German diplomat Max von Brandt, 1835 to 1920, in Japan 1862 to 1875, referring to the article from Blackwood in the Japan Gazette, he says German customs officer at Tientsin, Gustav Dettring, told von Krenke, a German consul in Kobe, that the offer had been made to him of being ambassador extraordinary to the powers, but he had declined. Ito told him that Dr. L. H. Lernholm was writing a pamphlet to be published in Germany, refuting Die Zukunft Ostasiens, East Asia's future, a pamphlet by von Brandt, which attacked Japan. Of Lernholm, Goodschmidt expressed an unfavorable opinion, says he is an intriguer, trying to curry favor with the Japanese by pretending to be one of them. Today, being Sayonji's first reception, went to him. He confirmed my idea that the Japanese government had made up their minds to agree not to insist upon the payment of the installment of war indemnity and conclusion of commercial treaty before evacuating Liaotsung. They had not yet heard what was the serious guarantee which the Russian government proposed to offer, and had consequently not given their formal answer. For Moson's sugar, it was agreed at the Cabinet Council a few days ago to admit goods which could be proved to have been shipped from Formosa to Nagasaki, Kobe, or Osaka without payment of duty, and a notification would appear in a few days. He has sent Kilby's proofs to the Finance Department. A plot to assassinate Ito, which the papers speak of, was genuine, but apparently confined to the two individuals. The gravamen, i.e. grievance, was the conduct of the Chishima Ravenna case from the beginning. Mutsu is worse than he was, but still lively and full of hope about himself. Not true that he has resigned. Sayonji saw him yesterday, and he talked with great vigor. Russia intriguing in Korea would still go on, even if Japan agreed not to interfere there. Kobe cholera agrees with the opinion I expressed the other day to Komura. It seems something might be done next spring. Count Soeshima Taneomi, politician and privy councillor from Saga, 1828 to 1905, came in consequence of my having proposed to call on him. He is 66 years of age, looks mild. Talked of Liaotsung, which I said would have been a great expense to them. He said that he would rather have given up Formosa and stuck to Liaotsung. At Peking, he had seen that there were two elements in the Chinese state, Kan, the Han dynasty, and Man, Manchurian Qing dynasty. The Russians would have no difficulty in winning the latter to their side if they feared any danger from the former in the way of rebellion. A descendant of Genghis Khan is living in Russian territory. I asked him about the composition of the cabinet, whether there was any Hizen or Tosa men in it, as at the beginning of the Restoration. He replied no, and that in the late war all the glory was carried off by Satsuma men. The government could not have stood had it not gone to war. He said, speaking as an outsider and not as an official, that he hoped England and Japan would be on intimate terms. His son and heir, Soejima Michimasa, recently came back from Cambridge, where he had graduated B.A. Himself is a member of the Privy Council and the members have a private order from the emperor not to sit in the House of Peers so as to avoid having a palace party. Miss Gibson came to play chess and tea. Also, Miss Lowther and Dubule, R.D.B. Layard, consular assistant Yokohama, arrived. That's Raymond de Burr Layard. Dined with Miss Gibson at the Imperial Hotel. The Lowthers, Miss Divers, Dubule, and Parlett also of the party. 4th of October. Count Inoue Kaoru called. Looks very young, hardly a grey hair, though he says he is 61. We talked about Korea, and I said my idea had always been that Japan was more fitted to lead Korea in the path of progress, as there was much more similarity between them than between the Koreans and Chinese. The language shows this. Tonghak, Eastern Learning, religious movement in Korea. It was originally against Christianity, now against official oppression. The Taeonkun regent, very cruel, sanguinary murder of his opponents, especially of the Min Taijo some years ago. In 1869, Kido Koin had advocated a war with Korea as a means of quieting Japanese internal dissensions, but Saigo Kichinosuke, Saigo Takamori, opposed. Several years later, the two had changed roles. He stayed for about an hour. I told him Kato had asked Lord Salisbury's advice about Hitrova's communication, but they had heard nothing from him. In the afternoon, went to Count Okuma Shigenobu, who was very friendly. Very glad I had been appointed here, as I knew Japan from the days of the feudal system and had many friends here. Since Sir Harry Parkes left in 1883, Her Majesty's government had not sent any man of weight here. Neither Right Honourable Sir Francis Plunkett, 1835 to 1907, Minister in Japan, 1884 to 7, Mr. Hugh Fraser, 1837 to 94, Minister, 1889 to 94, nor Honourable P. Lepeur Trench, Minister, 1894 to 5, understood Eastern problems. Very friendly, but nothing more. Sir Harry used to pitch into them, but he did them many a good turn, especially during the Restoration, when the Imperial Party would have been much inconvenienced if England had taken the same line as France and America. When Sir Harry left in 1883, he had called to say goodbye and remarked that sooner or later they would have trouble with China on account of Korea. For a long time past, Japan had been greatly provoked by China on more than one occasion, especially when Admiral Ting came to Nagasaki with the Chinese squadron, and there were rows there between the crews and the townspeople provoked by the Chinese. Then the decoying of Kim Ok-kyun, 1851 to 94, to Shanghai, his murder there, the interference of the Chinese to prevent his body being brought to Japan by a steamer of NYSK, Nippon Yusen Kaisha, and sending it with the murderer to Korea in a Chinese man of war, where the body was cut in pieces and exposed as members of a traitor and the assassin rewarded. NYSK is the Japan Steamship Company. But the government had behaved with the greatest self-restraint. It was not true that Japan had sought to make war with China, though she was fully prepared, and the War Department was anxious to prove the weapons they had perfected. Luckily for them, they had managed to get a quantity of quick-firing guns just before the war was declared, and they had twice as many as were needed for their navy. Still, they were very anxious for the result of a battle, as the Chinese vessels were stronger, and they had many foreign officers. But as for the army, they were quite at ease in their minds, even if there had been foreign officers, as the Chinese troops were not ready to fight. And there was such an enthusiasm in Japan that they would easily have raised and equipped another 100,000 men. At present, they were not ready to encounter another enemy, for their manufacturing power, i.e. of weapons and finance, were not sufficiently developed. The present magazine rifle was not good, and they were working to supply another better model. But it would be some time before they could furnish 300,000 men with rifles. Another enemy presumably means Russia. Of ships, they could easily purchase enough, and their maritime population gave them a source of supply which a couple of years would convert into efficient sailors. But officers took many years longer. However, there were more entries than before to the Naval College. We talked about the government. He said the military members of the cabinet did not bother about politics, being satisfied if their departments were not interfered with. In fact, of late years, the interference of military element in politics had greatly abated. The present Minister of Finance was a good permanent official who knew his business, but had no political influence. Mutsu would not be able to resume office, which was a great pity. He knew Mutsu as one of my friends. Sayonju, very intelligent and of excellent family, is a younger brother of Marquis Tokudaiji, but very much a shosei student, disliking the trammels of office. Had been told he must now be a serious person, to which he had answered he would not give up his habits of life for either place or emoluments. The Diet would probably not be summoned for some time, as the necessary calculations for the naval and military departments involve many difficult combinations. He spoke without any bitterness. Speaking of England's policy of late years, he said she had not noticed that the trade of Japan had risen in a few years from 1/10 of that of China to more than a half, and if things went on as they are now doing, might in a few years be more than the whole. He rejoiced to think that Her Majesty's government was now devoting her intentions to the extreme east, where she ought to occupy a great position. As to China, he doubted whether she would ever rise to be of any political weight, and that was a matter of concern to Japan, for if she fell under the influence of a European power, then Japan would be left alone in a position of danger. 5th of October, drove with Miss Lowther to gardens at Some and Sugamo, came across Ito Koyemon, who supplied trees for the legation grounds in 1875, having been recommended by Miyamoto Koichi. Takaoka Kaname, my first teacher, now called Okada Tokichi, turned up. Told him he should have 10 yen a month until I could see whether I had anything special for him to do, and gave him a first 10 yen. 6th of October, lunched at Seiyokan and went to the museum afterwards, where there is a manuscript psalter in Japanese dating from the time of the persecutions, Moon Called. 7th of October, went to Ito Hirobumi to talk about contents of a private letter which I received from O'Connor today, the minister in Peking, British minister. Mentioned the article in Blackwood, which is being reprinted in the Japan Gazette, which affirms that Li Hongchang agreed to the concession of Liao Tsung because he knew the three powers would interfere. Ito combated this on the ground that they did not know beforehand long enough what the Japanese terms would be. I said that the press had for some time before talked of Liao Tsung, Formosa, and an indemnity, and everyone knew that whatever the people wished, the government could rely on their thorough support for, as had been shown by the unanimity with which the Parliament voted the supplies. On their thorough support for. So the powers certainly expected that Japan would make those demands. Besides, the correspondents of the Times from Tokyo to London papers said the same thing. Then I went on to talk about the dominating position of the three powers in Eastern Asia and the diminution of Japanese prestige in consequence, and about West River, all of which I put in a dispatch. Afterwards, he broached the subject of old times, the idea he had mentioned to me at Osaka in 1868 of making the daimyos surrender their lands, and that I had advised they should leave them in a position like that of the English nobility. But he knew that if they were left in possession, their retainers would hold by them, and the clan feeling would not be extinguished. Kido Koin had proposed to give the Mikado Sekishu and Kokura. The Satsuma people wanted to let him have 100,000 koku. Then Kido came to see him at Kobe, and he, Ito, said that the daimyos must give up everything. To Kido, that seemed a dangerous proposal, but he went back to Kyoto and discussed it with Okubo Ichizo and Saigo Kichinosuke, Takamori, and then to Choshu, to the prince. The latter said he was quite willing to give up to the Mikado, for he had been devoting himself to that cause so long that no sacrifice was too great. But he said, take care what you do, for it is very dangerous. So they put it off for a while, saying nothing about it. But in 1871, Satsuma Choshu Tosa and Hizen led the way, and the others followed. Then he asked me if I recollected all about Shimonoseki, and I mentioned Sugi Tokusuke and Shishido Tamaki, who came with him, and Ibara Kazuye to Yokohama. Sugi is in the Empress Dowager's household, Shishido in the House of Peers. We recalled also his visit with Inoue to Choshu before the bombardment of Shimonoseki, and the events of the first month of KO4, the Bizen affair, which caused us to occupy Kobe. That's the Kobe incident. Sir Harry's strong language to him about the claims of the merchants against daimyos, which he said, you must pay, although altogether he was very friendly. The Lowthers, Gutschmidt, Kirkwood, and Parlett dined to play whist. At dinner, they said, i.e. Gutschmidt and Miss Lowther, that I knew too much about early days in Japan, and the Japanese had therefore been afraid of my coming back, that I had said that Ito had burnt the legation on Gotenyama. I laughed and said the story was a common one, and had been repeated to me just after my return by a high personage, and that I knew where all this talk about me came from, i.e. Francis Brinkley, the editor of the Japan Mail. Chamberlain and Dubule to lunch. 10th of October, went to Saionji, who talked rather freely about Korean affairs. I said that for my part, I thought they had better tether the dragon until something was settled about Liao Tsung, and as there was a prospect of the Chinese not being in any hurry to pay 30 million taels, it was possible that the evacuation would be delayed until next spring. Paget Wildman Parlet to dinner. 13th of October, Dr. Atsumi and his son from Yokohama came in the afternoon and sat 3 hours, 20 minutes, the old man taking all the time, except during the presence of Watanabe Shujiro, author of a book, The Japanese Abroad, and de Labry, the military attaché, and Vierge, secretary of the French legation, who came to call. Moon dined. 14th of October, went to pay visit of ceremony to their Imperial Highnesses Arisugawa Takehito and his wife, a daughter of the Kaga Maeda. They were very affable, talked Japanese the whole time. Mrs. Katsunosuke Inoue was there to act as interpreter, and Viscount Yamao Yozo and a Mr. Sato Momotaro, who says he once met me in Italy, and a naval attaché or ADC, aide-de-camp also. Tom Glover, that's Thomas Blake Glover of Nagasaki, and Iwasaki Yanosuke called, Iwasaki of Mitsubishi. Also G.A. Goodwin, who wants to get position as a consulting engineer in England from anyone who will employ him. Went to Goto Shojiro, who looked ill and old. His wife, he says, had her health ruined by having to wear European costume. He was in Japanese clothes. Seems much alarmed about the turn things may take in Korea, and that Russia will take this opportunity of asserting herself there. The only thing is for Japan and England to make common cause against the enemy. Told him Lord Salisbury very busy just now in bringing the Turks to reason about Armenia and the Chinese about the missionary massacres, and I did not know what he would do, but for my part I should greatly regret if England allowed Japan to be crushed. Goto says Charles W. Legendre came here 3 or 4 years ago when Enomoto was Minister for Foreign Affairs on a mission from Korean government about Japanese fishermen poaching in the seas off Kelpa, Jeju Island, and even landing there and building huts. But as he had no credentials, Japanese government refused to treat with him. Since then, he has been unfriendly and acted as a go-between of the Queen and the Russian minister Weber. It was in his presence that the Queen was killed, either in his room or hers. Some footnotes. Enomoto Takeaki. It is said that her head was cut off, which looks like a Japanese performance. No doubt Japanese were mixed up in it. Japanese Minister General Miura was at the palace 5 minutes later in his uniform. All this came in a long telegram from Legendre to Dunn, who went at once to the Foreign Office and saw Hara, but the latter pretended not to know anything of what had happened. The Queen, it seems, has stuffed up Inoue Kaoru, that the Min family were the real friends of Japan, and he came back so fully imbued with that idea that he made a speech at Kobe saying that the whole policy of Japan hitherto had been based on a mistake. Inoue, he says, has a head after the European pattern. He tried to introduce all sorts of reforms when he went over there last summer, and the palace people pretended to accept them, but in reality detested the changes, to carry out which it would be necessary for Inoue to be made King of Korea. He was, in fact, talking of the good dispositions of the Min family at the very moment the news arrived. Goto said further that the German, French, and Russian men of war had arrived simultaneously at Incheon, and that they were going together about Korea as they had about Liaotsung. Formosa, of course, partly crippled Japanese military resources, but as far as Japan herself goes, no invasion was possible. Her fleet, however, was not ready as she had only cruisers. Russia had intended to wait till the completion of the Siberian Railway, but the events of last year had given her a good opportunity which she should not miss, and what had now happened in Korea would also be turned to good account by her. Some people advocated Japan allying herself with France and Russia, but what good would that do her? He quite understood German policy was not unfriendly to Japan, but circumstances were too strong for her. If she had gone on the side of Japan, what help could Japan have given her in Europe against France and Russia? 15th of October, to Yokohama to lunch with the Reeds at number 11. Darnetan's Miss Ella Tuck, Mrs. Bonar, Babington, director of the Chinese National Bank, and Philip of Strawn and Company, called on the Layards, had engaged to dine and go to theatre with Wheelers, but morning rained so heavily that I telegraphed an excuse. 17th of October, called on Dunn and made the acquaintance of Mrs. Blakiston, widow of Captain Blakiston, long resident at Hakodate. Dunn is sure that some Japanese were concerned in coup d'etat at Seoul. Horace N. Allen of the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires, in the absence of J.M.B. Sill, is very much under the influence of the Russian. Dunn's idea is that the best arrangement as to Korea would be for it to be governed by an union of the powers, with Denmark and Switzerland as then mandatory in the name of the king. I said the question would be who could propose it. Only a power known, then there's a note on Blakiston. Only a power known to be disinterested, such as the US, but I don't know whether she would put her finger into such a pie. Dunn said certainly not. William M. Dye is the name of the American general who was present at the affair in the palace. He and Horace N. Allen declare they recognize Japanese leaving the palace among the assailants, but Dunn thinks this is not certain, as Koreans in European dress would have the same look, and only language would identify. Representative of Hawaii, Robert Irwin, left cards on. Soeshima returned his call. He said he was very anxious about the negotiations with the three powers, so I told him I understood it was settled that China should pay an indemnity, and when it had been received, the Japanese troops would be withdrawn. Donetans, Lowthers, and Paget dined. Margin note, Watanabe Shujiro told Gubbins that a Major Okamoto, who was concerned in the Guards' mutiny some years ago and was cashiered then, is supposed to have been in the coup d'etat. Dunn also told me this. 18th of October, Thompson came. Gave him a packet of dispatches for O'Connor and a bag for Jameson containing the cipher E. Goodsmith told him that it has been arranged that Komura and the Russians are to carry on a joint inquiry into the late circumstances at Seoul. Thompson hears from a correspondent at Bangkok, Damrong, that Siam has expressed her willingness to accept a British protectorate. Blue secret. Whether Foreign Office will grant is uncertain. Thompson thinks that Chargé d'Affaires and Consul General in Siam, Maurice William Ernest de Bunsen, has not sufficient influence at the Foreign Office to push it through. Says has letters from Siamese Foreign Minister Prince Deva Wongse thanking him for the assistance he gave in 1893, that he has not been near the Times because they are hurt at assistance he gave at his warnings, having been justified by events. He has taken the house of Yoshida Kiyonari's widow at Shinagawa, through Sanamiya's agency, and means to establish himself there. Has had an interview with Ito, who was very friendly. By giving $2,000 to the Red Cross Society and paying a handsome rent for Yoshida's house, he has created a good social atmosphere for himself. Said that the feeling here was friendly to me, the only thing being that at Yokohama there was a slight impression that I was not well disposed to them. But even de Bunsen, formerly Secretary of Legation in Tokyo, January 1891, Chargé d'Affaires, June 1892 to February 1894, who was persona gratissima to both sides, is now blamed for the flaws in the treaty, particularly for no provision having been made for pending cases. Margin note, went to Saionji and gave him a memo about adhesion of Canada to the new treaty. Nakada Takanori, Saionji's secretary at Foreign Office, charged with this business. Went to Saionji, who said that Miura was concerned in the plot to enter the palace. He seemed very anxious that it should not be supposed that the Japanese government was in the plot. 19th of October, Layards came up to stop with daughter Christabel to dinner, Gubbins and his wife. Lunch, Dubule. After lunch, Layard and I walked to Kishinojin in Kobinate. To dinner, the Longfords and Parlett. October 21st, went to Père Évrard in the afternoon. We spoke of the treaty and I expressed my satisfaction at it being a fait accompli, which would probably give a better tone to foreign relations. He said that it would have been much better in 1882 to accept the Japanese proposals, as much that has since happened would have been obviated, and I agreed with him. Made the acquaintance of Monsignor Ossouf, who has been here since 1877, a charming manner. Du Boulay to dinner. October 22nd, Layards left. October 23rd, went to Ito by appointment. He was evidently anxious to have a talk about Korea and almost immediately asked my opinion, which I gave him pretty straight, regretting the necessity of having to speak plainly. Also told him privately about the Thales being stopped on the high seas by the Imperial Japanese Navy ship Yaeyama, and said I should not speak to the foreign minister until I had instructions from home. In the meantime, I recommended him to telegraph to his admiral to inquire, which he would understand. Ito wanted me to tell him what they should do, but I declined to express an opinion. October 24th, telegram from Lord Salisbury instructing me to inquire of the Japanese government what explanation they have to give of Thales. Wrote a private note to Ito to say I should speak to Foreign Minister Saionji this afternoon, and hoping that he would be prepared to undertake that full satisfaction would be given by the Japanese government. Munter, representative of Armstrong Mitchell Company Limited, came to call, gave me the following information about Japanese plans. 4 first-class battleships of 15,000 tons, 3 first-class cruisers of 7,000, 4 second-class of 4,500, like the Yoshino, besides smaller craft. The cost to be at 180 million, which the Diet would be asked to vote, 50 million being for armaments. He wants my good word. Perhaps the American people, consisting of Dunn, Dennison, and Williams, might be placated by giving them orders for the armor plates needed for the battleship, which is to be constructed in Japan. 1 cruiser of each class here also. The Japanese are guided by sentiment of gratitude for protection to Japanese interests during the war, and to Henry Willard Dennison for his services in negotiating the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Williams has gone back to America to get plans. Replied to him that I could not tout, as that would not be worthy of a great power like England, but would drop a hint that the performances of the Yoshino at the Yellow Fight had two footnotes pleased English people very much, and that if the Japanese, being of the same opinion as to the superior qualities of the English-built ships, go to England for their new vessels, English nation will be gratified at this mark of appreciation of what they can do, so as to let Ito understand that I am not merely proudly indifferent. Munter said that as far as he could learn, the Marine Department are all in favor of English ships. The French are quite out of it. First, the Unebi capsized, and another built in France could never do her proper speed. In fact, the unfortunate Chishima. She was left for a whole year on the hands of the builders, who finally had to make a sacrifice of part of the contract price. What I said to Munter, I said also to Thompson the other day. I added to Munter that I could not promise to speak at any precise time, but must watch my opportunity. Margin note, Pierre Evrard lunched, and I lent him my copy of the Oxford Contemptus Mundi, which I made at the Bodleian Library in Oxford University. Dined with British Railway engineer Charles A.W. Pownall's. 25th of October, Bishop Bickersteth, Pownall's, Kirkwood's, Paget to dine. 26th of October, Goto Shojiro came, talked a good deal about old times, then told me a story of Inoue having dished him in the matter of the Korean loan, which Ito had promised to let him have. Said Inoue must be very stupid if he did not foresee what was about to happen when he left Korea, for the murder of the Queen occurred only a week after his return here. He was responsible for presenting to the Korean government as military advisor Okamoto Ryunosuke, the man accused of taking the Queen's life. He also took over Hoshitoru and Sato Shinchiro. I told him I feared the Queen's murder would cause much trouble to the Japanese government and give the Russians a handle for demanding withdrawal of the Japanese garrisons. That my advice was to inform the powers that they would withdraw, in fact what I said to Ito on the 23rd, and invite them to settle Korean affairs by general agreement. He said that was his view also, but Ito was not the proper person to do it. There must be a new government. I replied that as a foreigner, I of course could not offer an opinion on such a topic as a change of cabinet. He assented and proceeded to say that he was too undecided, always changing his mind. That Ito was too undecided, yes. Thus, he had promised Matsugata to insist on a large indemnity and no territory on the mainland. 2 footnotes. But the war party afterwards induced him to break his word. Danaton or someone else had being announced, he took his leave, begging me to consider all he had said as strictly confidential, as he would treat my remarks, and not to repeat anything he had said about individuals, said he would come again. Kusaka Yoshio also called, and a man named Seihin Ikeda, later head of the Mitsui Zaibatsu, a graduate of Harvard, who came over from Vancouver with me. He wants employment. One of the horses I bought the day before yesterday fell lame, and I had to forego intention of driving them out. 27th of October, walked in the afternoon with Kirkwood round by the botanical gardens, Gokokuji and Kishinojin home. 28th of October, went to Yokohama and lunched with the Halls, gave Mitford's order for plants to Louis Burma, Asked Konoike's people to design me a cup for Mitford's boy twin. On my way back, went to Ito by appointment with a note in brief headings of my advice about Korea. He read it attentively and ejaculated, "Not quite," then produced from a large bundle of telegrams the draft of one that he dispatched on the 25th to all powers except Holland, and embodying my suggestions. Other telegrams, he said, were about a proposal to raise a German-English loan for the second half of the indemnity. Then he talked about the demand that the Kunrentai, literally training group, should be dismissed, and I told him I would telegraph home. He had telegraphed to Nishi Tokujiro, minister in Moscow, about it. Also telegrams from Aoki Shuzo in Berlin, and the minister in Paris, which he said I must keep entirely to myself, about friendly attitude of France and Germany. Told him Komura ought to try to win the influence of German consul in Korea, F. Kreen, and British Consul General Walter C. Hillier. So that was that, so that we might balance Russian intrigues. 29th of October, Nakada brought the same telegram from Saionji to communicate with me, but carried off the copy. He came yesterday morning, just as I had started for Yokohama. Told him to be quite sure that Kato communicated it verbatim to Lord Salisbury. The horse is better, his lameness having arisen from retention of urine. J.L. Parsons from Australia, father and son, Brinkley, Kirkwood Longford, Dunn and Duboulet to dinner. 30th of October, Goodschmidt. Instructions received about booze, not the same as mine. He had the telegram about Korea communicated to him, and so has Hitrovo, who expressed to Japanese a slightly more definite fixing of the date of evacuation. James P. Mollison about a plan for constructing dynamite works in Japan. Imperial government to manufacture ballesterie en place. So I would try and ask Saigo Tsugumichi if his refusal was definite and final. Then Captain Tolmi Tresida, CMG of John Brown and Company Limited, with J. Rossiter Hoyle, Director of Thomas Firth and Sons, and Richard J. Kirby of Okura and Company. The former want a word spoken on their behalf. In the afternoon, Robert Irwin, Reverend C.W. Moss, and De La Rica, the latter of whom sat for more than an hour. Letter from A.J. Boscawen, MP, who knows young Cotton, a friend of Solcombe. There was to have been a party at Yamashino no Miya's, but abandoned on account of serious illness of Prince Kee-tah Shirakawa. Takaoka Kaname sent him 10 yen. Okay, I think I will stop here for the time being. Seems convenient. And let me close this and see you again in the next video. Goodbye.